everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to dye some yarn with some cherry Kool-Aid to create some subtle speckles. Kool-Aid is great for dyeing yarn because it has citric acid and the artificial food coloring in the little packet. And the yarn we're using today is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. You need to make sure you pick a protein-based like wool, alpaca, silk yarn for dyeing with food coloring or Kool-Aid. I'm pre-soaking the yarn for 30 minutes at room temperature in some plain tap water, so that way the yarn is damp and ready for us to add some speckles. Now I'm protecting my work surface with some cling wrap as sort of a double duty here. One is to prevent adding dye to my countertop, and the other is that we'll use this to wrap up the yarn to set these speckles in the microwave later on. And that's just the first step. The second step of today's project will be to kettle dye our newly speckled yarn in a tiny bit more Kool-Aid, so that way we can have a pastel base. And now I'm taking our pre-soaked yarn and I'm going to squeeze that excess water out. Again, I pre-soaked for 30 minutes and there was no additional acid in that pre-soak. All the acid we need is already in that packet of Kool-Aid. And we're not even going to use one full packet of Kool-Aid today. There is a lot of pigment in that cherry Kool-Aid. And this is just a technique I love to do, and I thought it would be really useful to show, not in a live stream, that you can speckle first and then over dye that yarn. So that is our plan. But for sharper speckles, we do want to have that liquid removed from the yarn, and I'm now spreading it out as much as possible. So that way, as I speckle, we can access more of the yarn at any given time. Now I said we're using less than one packet, and I had saved maybe half of a packet in this container, and that is what we're going to use today. And I'll just tap a little bit out of what was left, I guess, in that package. Also, so, I mean, we don't want to leave any dye behind. But the one first tip I would give about speckling, and I like to take a small pinch of the powder and very slowly add that onto the yarn. And so I'm trying to show again just how tiny, and I'm just slowly letting the granules fall out. But it's important to make sure your hands are dry. So if you are going to touch the yarn, then you might want to rinse your glove off first and wipe it with a paper towel or something, so that way the dye isn't sticking to your glove. And so here's another view of me taking a small pinch and just slowly letting those granules fall. Now you can also get heavier. You don't have to slowly. You can get more splotches or heavier patches of speckles. That's all a preference. Some people like to use dusting wands or salt shakers to do something like this, but I'm a tactile person, so I personally prefer just this approach of doing it with my fingers really slowly and carefully on the yarn. And I think I'm just coming in for another view. One place where you want to make sure that you pay special attention is around the ties, just because the ties themselves will sort of hold onto the yarn a little bit more. So you might want to move things around more around the ties. But we also will at some point move the yarn to add more dye to the other side and to make sure that we have speckles sort of all the way through. But again, it depends on how heavy you want the speckles to be. And I decided to, in some places, have the speckles be heavier than others. But I think for simplicity, I only put a glove on one hand, just I guess for this time, it's not really even a time lapse, it's not sped up, but just to show which hand I'm using for speckling versus not. And so I'm keeping that hand I was using with speckling dry, and also not, or at least trying to, I might accidentally do this later, trying not to touch the yarn with that gloved hand, because with the dye on the glove, that'll add a bigger splotch, when my goal at the moment is to do more of a speckle. So I hope that that makes sense. When it comes to picking the flavor of Kool-Aid to use, cherry is one of the most pigmented. Black cherry and grape are also really pigmented for speckles, but lemonade isn't super pigmented, and pink lemonade, you could still speckle with them. But if you want to speckle and then over dye, like we're doing today, it might be really subtle, still beautiful, but you might have trouble seeing some of those changes. And so I've flipped the yarn again, and we are adding some more speckles. And I guess while I'm continuing to speckle the yarn, this is a good moment to say subscribe and like this video if you find this helpful. I think that when I was filming this, maybe I intended to speed this part up. And you can see I'm now adding some slightly heavier speckles, in part to make sure that things will show up in the end, on top of however much color I add into our pot. But also, sometimes I like those areas of heavy speckles. So it's fun to go with the flow and see where the colors take you as you are doing a project like this. I don't know, it's fun. And one of the best things about dyeing yarn with KoolAid is that it's kitchen safe. I'm comfortable doing this with my kids. Clearly I've added all the color I want, and zooming in, you can see these speckles and these sharp speckles that we got. I wouldn't squeeze the yarn too much in the process because you don't want to help the color spread out. We want it to stay where it's hitting. But as I said, this is something that I like to do with my kids. And so it is fun and kitchen safe, and I use my own kitchen pots and pans and microwave to do this. With commercial dyes, I wouldn't do that though. So I'm wrapping the yarn up in some plastic wrap, and we're gonna go microwave it. And I microwave the yarn on high for a total of 4 minutes using 2-minute increments in my microwave. And now I'm placing it in a microwave safe dish. 4 minutes. And then once it's microwaved, you can see maybe a little dye beaded up on the plastic, but now we just want to wait and let it cool completely. And while that's cooling, we can start setting up our pastel color for overdyeing. So I think that this was 8 cups of water, and I'm going to start by adding 1 pinch, which I think is 1/16 of a teaspoon of that KoolAid powder into the 8 cups of water. There's less than 1 tablespoon of color in 1 packet of KoolAid, I found, because from when measuring. So I wanted to start with just a little bit of color, and then we can add more as needed. But I didn't want to have the color be so pigmented that it would completely cover up the speckles. I wanted more of a pink, and that was what I was going for. And checking the color with a spoon, I'm like, okay, this is pretty pastel. I think we can have a little bit more color. So I decided to add, and I'm just checking the color on a paper towel, but I did decide to go ahead and add another pinch. So I think we're at a total of 1/8 of a teaspoon of this powder. And you can see there's still a lot of powder left in that container. I think we had enough here where easily we could have dyed 200 or 300 grams in this colorway, all from the remnants of 1 packet of cherry KoolAid. So yeah, and there's a fair amount left. And so I just need to stir it up to dissolve. Once our yarn is cool, we will be adding the cool yarn to the cool pot, so that way we can try to get some color coverage over the whole skein. But I guess I will be talking about that, well, I guess now. We'll unwrap it. I don't remember if I zoom in again on the yarn. I did take a lot of notes for this tutorial that I'm voiceovering, but yeah, there are some very pretty, oh, here we go, close up. See, we've got some speckles. There's some wash of color. Speckles would be even sharper if the yarn was hot as we were adding the dye, but there are absolutely speckles there. And now I think we're ready to add the cooled yarn to the pot. Or at least I'm checking to see if it's cool. Maybe I'm waiting a few more minutes before I come back to do it. But you do want it to be cool, because if the yarn is still warm, it'll start absorbing that color as soon as you add it to the pot. And so I'm folding it up a bit and just trying to make sure it's ordered and not tangled as I put it in. And I'm adding the yarn to the pot and moving it around so that way all of the yarn can access all of that color. And it is going to still soak up the color quickly because of the acid that is in that KoolAid packet. You can't separate the acid from the KoolAid because it's there. If you were doing this with food coloring, then I would have started with no acid in the pot. But in this short time scale, almost all that color has already absorbed. We still want to heat set it, but it's absorbing fast. And so now I am adding this onto the stove, and I think to heat up probably around 20 or 30 minutes. Even though the color is basically clear already, we do want to make sure that we've heat set the yarn so that way that color is set and we've got something that is wash safe. So this color can last a really long time. But zooming in, you can still see our little speckles. So I didn't add too much color into the pot. And so I wanted to zoom in and show those teeny speckles. Some people prefer to speckle after, and a lot of times I prefer to do a base color first and add the speckles on later. But one reason why this time, I just wanted to show you could do it the other way. But one perk of doing your pastel color first and then adding speckles is you can then tell if you need to be heavier. You can see if they're showing up well. Whereas if you do the speckles first and over dye it, you could really cover up some of those speckles. But yeah, at this stage, I'm going to turn off the heat and let the yarn, sometimes I let it cool down in the pot. Sometimes I set it aside and let it cool completely in another container. It looks like I'm going to set it aside, but either way, you do want the yarn to cool completely before you wash it. In part not to shock the fibers, but also that cooling off process helps that reaction between the dye and the yarn become permanent, and so you can really set that color. And yay, we see our speckles. See, it works. And if the speckles are set properly, you're not going to damage them by over dyeing them. So over dyeing is a choice from many, many situations. But now we are going to wash the yarn in some cool tap water. Eventually I'll add some dish soap, but I guess first I want to make sure it's not tangled. A lot of times I'll add a zip tie onto my yarn to prevent tangles, and if the yarn is tangled, try to like put your hand around the whole thing so it doesn't get tangled worse. But waiting until the yarn is dry to detangle is a lot easier. But we're not seeing any bleeding. I'm now adding some dish soap just to rinse out the flavoring. There's no sugar in these packets, but you want to rinse everything else out just so that way the yarn is clean. And really soon, I will be back with a dry yarn to give you some conclusions. But this is just another way you can do a soft speckled colorway using KoolAid. And it really is one of my favorite things to play with and how I got started on my own yarn dyeing adventure. And oh yeah, there are some mystery blue speckles that I'll point out at the end. I don't know if that's color breaking or what, but I know I talk about that in the conclusions. And oh yeah, I think that's me. Okay, so that's me finding those blue speckles and trying to tell myself as I'm rewatching to do the voiceover that those blue speckles are there. But I do talk about that over in the conclusions where we should be momentarily. But anyway, I know that sometimes when I do a technique in a live stream, it makes sense to redo it as a standalone video so that way you can see exactly how I did it. Here is the finished beautiful and yet still subtle speckled colorway from using way less than one packet of cherry KoolAid. We added the speckles to the yarn first and then heat set it in the microwave and then kettle dyed this in with a hint of some color to give us this beautiful pink base. There are a few blue surprises here, which are surprising for many reasons. It's cherry KoolAid, and also this blue is much, much more pigmented than what I would see with like blue raspberry KoolAid. Now, some other people have reported some blue breaking when speckling with cherry. It's possible that there was some other KoolAid in this mix when I like saved the packet. I don't know for sure how likely that was. It could just be there are some concentrated blue pigments that normally just mix into the color, and but with speckling we saw it pop out. I'm honestly not sure, but I thought that that was important to point out. And like here is another tiny one. Don't forget that to dye yarn with KoolAid you need a protein-based yarn animal fibers like wool, alpaca, silk, mohair. You can do blends with acrylic and with cotton, but you will end up with more muted colors overall. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and if you love the yarn that I dye, go and check out the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. There are hundreds of skeins of yarn that have been dyed in my videos. You can even see the video title and the date it was published in the description of my listings, so you can learn more about the yarn or watch me dye it as you knit. I am continuing to play around with different formats when it comes to my videos, especially time lapses with voiceovers after the fact, so please let me know what you think about this format down in the video description. As you know, with no childcare at the moment, I am needing to get a little creative with my creativity to film and produce content, but I'm still committed to producing 2 videos a week, and please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of it. I love exploring adding color to yarn, and I often will share my experiences as I try something for the first time. Or, like in this video, revisit something that I've done over and over in just a slightly different way to try to make yarn dyeing as accessible and approachable to all of you. Thank you so much for watching.